Llywydd.
Thank you very much, Llywydd. The laying of the draft budget and the process of scrutiny that follows are among the most consequential actions that we take as a Senedd. Today, as the journey to the final budget debate in March begins, I will set out both sides of the income and expenditure ledger which underpins the proposals before the members. After more than a decade of sustained austerity, the UK economy has experienced the longest period of radically suppressed growth in modern history. Throughout it all, wages have been held down, investment plans have been abandoned, and public services have been starved. Llywydd, we have seen two UK budgets in this calendar year, and the contrast between them could not have been more vivid. For today, just one set of figures must suffice to illustrate that difference. In March, in the final budget of the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt, we saw an uplift in the capital budgets available to the Welsh Government. In an era of rampant construction cost inflation, for all the investment needed in our schools, hospitals, housing and transport, all he could offer was £1 million in additional funding. Fast forward now to the 30th of October. Now, a Labour Chancellor, determined to put our economy back on the path to growth, recognised that this could only be achieved by investment. Investment in the conditions that allow an economy to grow. And Llywydd, this was not just a theoretical recognition, but one that was intensely practical. Instead of presenting a budget to you today with only £1 million of additional capital to allocate, this draft budget reflects in full the additional £235 million in capital provided by Rachel Reeves in October and more. That is why this draft budget really is a budget for a brighter tomorrow, providing public services and Welsh citizens with investments in their future which have been denied to them for far too long. Llywydd, I set out today the first steps to that brighter future. Of course, it would be impossible to complete this process in a single budget. But in sharp contrast to the hugely difficult budgets of recent years, I have the privilege of putting before you a budget with new investments aligned with this government's priorities across all of our responsibilities.
Income side of today's draft budget. Consistent with the basic principles of prudent management, my aim has been to maximise the resources available to my colleagues, to citizens and to the things that matter most to them. The largest building block in the income available to the Senedd for next year comes, of course, through our membership of the United Kingdom, as mediated through the fiscal framework. That framework has delivered over £3 billion in additional investment for Welsh citizens since it was negotiated in 2016. And our membership of a Labour-led United Kingdom delivers a great deal more. Because of the step change away from austerity, the block grant for next year stands at £21 billion. £17.7 billion provides for day-to-day or revenue spending, and £3.4 billion is for investment or capital spending. And of that very significant sum, almost £1 billion is new money for 25-26. Now, the second building block in today's draft budget comes through the money raised by decisions taken in this Senedd. Welsh rates of income tax are expected to raise £3.462 billion in 2025-26, and for the reasons I rehearsed in front of the Finance Committee earlier in the autumn, the Cabinet has decided to leave those rates unchanged for the purposes of this budget. With the 2017 Wales Act transferred responsibility for two other taxes to this Senedd. Land transaction tax is forecast to raise £338 million in the next financial year. In the October UK budget, the Chancellor raised the higher rate on the purchase of additional residential properties in the equivalent tax in England and Northern Ireland by 2%. Today, as a result of this draft budget, higher rates in Wales will be raised by 1%, bringing that rate broadly into the line with changes to stamp duty, land tax across all border, and this decision is expected to raise an additional £7 million for public services next year. At the same time, I will be making changes to the current arrangements for claiming multiple dwelling relief to remove a current unfairness that allows some purchasers to benefit both from this relief and subsidiary dwelling exemption in the same transition. This budget will end that loophole. The threshold at which land transaction tax becomes payable in Wales stands at £225,000. The latest data shows that the current average cost of a property in Wales is £217,000 and for first-time buyers £188,000. Some 60% of homes in Wales are sold for below the threshold. I therefore plan to leave it at its current level for a further year. With landfill disposal tax is a very modest tax designed to influence behaviour as much, if not more, than raising funds. Today, I propose to make changes to the rates of LDT because the tax is no longer working hard enough to reduce the disposal of waste to landfill, as confirmed in the recent independent review of the tax. In this draft budget, therefore, I intend to raise the standard rate of LDT to £126.15 per tonne and to alter the lower rate from a fixed sum to a fixed percentage of the standard rate. For next year, that percentage will be fixed at 5%, raising the lower rate to £6.30 per tonne. I intend to keep the operation of this tax under close observation during 2025. I will not hesitate to raise the percentage of the lower rate again if the evidence does not demonstrate its effectiveness in the diversion of waste away from landfill. As a result of all these decisions, land disposal tax is next year forecast to raise £32 million. Finally, in these fiscal matters, I turn to non-domestic rates, which in 2025-26 are expected to have a gross value of more than £1.4 billion. That figure, however, takes no account of the reliefs provided to those ratepayers. Next year, the draft budget in front of members contains £215 million in permanent non-domestic rate relief, which now includes 100% support to all registered childcare providers. In addition to this, I have allocated a further £78 million to provide a sixth and final year of retail, leisure and hospitality temporary rates relief, which will once again be set at 40%. Since this temporary relief was introduced for retail, leisure and hospitality businesses in 2020-21, Welsh taxpayers have supported these sectors with an additional £1 billion. The draft budget also reflects a decision once again to hold the non-domestic rates multiplier at below the level of inflation. I have decided to use the full value of the consequential derived from multiplier decisions in England to benefit businesses in Wales. In 2025-26, the multiplier in Wales will rise by 1% at a permanent cost of a further £7 million. Taken together, these decisions mean £335 million will be devoted to non-domestic rate support in Wales in the next financial year. It is because of these decisions that almost half of all such ratepayers will continue to benefit from full non-domestic rate relief, with fewer than 1/3 of all Welsh businesses paying full rates. Now, these combined fiscal decisions, those which are devolved to Wales, will contribute more than £4 billion to the draft budget laid today. But Llywydd, a further number of important decisions influence the total resources available in next year's budget. I confirm this afternoon that once again this year, I intend to make maximum use of the borrowing capacity of the Welsh Government, adding a further £150 million in capital expenditure in the 2025-26 draft budget. And Llywydd, local authorities in Wales are also able to borrow for investment purposes. In cooperation with local government colleagues, I have decided to provide revenue support, which will enable local authorities to self-finance £60 million of further capital funding to be spent in a new programme of local highway maintenance, further extending our capital programme for next year and the contribution which Wales can make to reinvigorating growth in our economy. And when all of this is drawn together, the capital budget of the Welsh Government in 25-26 will exceed £3 billion for the first time in the devolution era. So finally, in this income side of the equation, I want to set out the interaction between monies raised through the United Kingdom and monies raised directly in Wales, or the block grant adjustment mechanism as it is known. The bargain at the heart of the 2017 Government of Wales Act in its fiscal devolution was this: if in Wales we managed our new devolved responsibilities more successfully than across the United Kingdom as a whole, we would see the financial benefit. Conversely, if matters were managed less successfully, we would have to pay the penalty in reduced funding from the UK Government. By now, Llywydd, we have sufficient data and sufficient evidence to draw some first conclusions. In this draft budget, that additional resource available to Wales as a result of the application of the block grant adjustment is an additional £317 million. That is made up of £253 million net contribution from Welsh rates of income tax, £44 million in net positive impact from LTT, and £19 million from landfill disposal tax. So I pay tribute to my predecessor, Rebecca Evans, and our excellent teams at the Welsh Treasury and the Welsh Revenue Authority for their management of the Welsh budget and our fiscal responsibilities over the period since 2017 in ways which have contributed to this significantly positive outcome. So when all these elements are taken together, the total amount available to allocate in the 2025-26 budget is £26,218 million. And even then, the story is not complete. Next year's budget follows in-year allocations and additional funding for above-inflation pay rises in the current financial year. Next year's budget already begins from a higher baseline than would ever have been the case had we been reliant on the plans of the previous government. Now, Llywydd, I have set out in some detail the ways in which the sum available to us next year has been built up, because I want to emphasise a point which successive finance ministers have made on the floor of this Senedd. The totals I have outlined this afternoon represent the maximum amount available for expenditure next year. When committees and other political parties propose that more should be allocated to various other priorities or purposes, the only way that can happen is to spend less on something else. Of course, I will listen very carefully to any such proposals, but I will look just as carefully at proposals for reducing expenditure when additional funding is proposed, because that is the only responsible way in which budget making can be conducted. Llywydd, I turn now to the expenditure proposals contained in this draft budget. Members will already have seen the headline allocations in the documentation published earlier this afternoon, and I will not repeat them here because it will be for individual Cabinet colleagues to set out the detail of how their budgets are to be used. I will simply set out the global sums. This draft budget provides an additional £610 million to the Health and Social Services portfolio, of which £175 million is capital expenditure. This represents a striking 70% uplift in capital for our health service, a figure far in excess of anything that has been possible in the last 14 years, and a figure that takes the total capital budget for health service purposes to more than £600 million next year. The Housing and Local Government budget rises by £400 million, including £120 million in capital funding, and my colleague Jane Bryant will set out the local government settlement when it is published tomorrow. Education spending rises by £112 million, the bulk of which comes as revenue. Transport sees an increase of £120.7 million for improvements to our roads and public transport. The budget of the Economy, Energy and Planning Department rises by £140.5 million, including substantial further investment in city and growth deals. The Climate Change and Rural Affairs MEG goes up by £108 million, and social justice, the smallest budget of all in the Welsh Government, rises by £10 million, including a 23% increase in capital. So I end by setting out 4 key principles which have guided the Cabinet in coming to the decisions which lie behind these figures. First of all, we have ensured that the First Minister's 4 priorities, which reflect the things that matter most to people throughout Wales, are fully reflected in these allocations. My colleagues will provide further details about these plans, but the funding available is there to ensure that we can make real and rapid progress in, for example, improving women's health services, accelerating the planning system, improving school attendance, securing coal tip safety, and the Core Valleys Lines transformational project. Secondly, Llywydd, in an era of climate change, where Wales has seen so vividly the result of extreme weather events over recent weeks, this is a budget shaped by the responsibilities which flow directly from the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, investing in the preventative actions we can take today to safeguard the interests of those who will come beyond us. And thirdly, Llywydd, this is emphatically a budget which puts us firmly back on the path to growth. We know that public investment, wisely used, acts to crowd in investment from private sources. The £575 million additional capital being allocated in this draft budget will do exactly that, stimulating private companies in the construction industry, taking forward our ambitions for the renewable energy economy of the future, paving the way for the investment summit which the First Minister will lead later next year. And lastly, Llywydd, it is, as any Labour government would be proud to produce, a budget which protects our most vulnerable. Alongside the draft budget, I have published a distributional analysis which show where the benefits of today's allocations will be most keenly felt. In sector after sector, in health, education, higher education, bus travel and social care, this is a budget which increases spending most of all on the 20% of our population which has the least. It is a budget, Llywydd. It is a budget for priorities, it is a budget for growth, and it is a budget which reminds people in Wales why time after time they have put their faith in a Labour government. A government which shares their values of trust, ambition, care for one another, and especially those who need that care the most. And that, Llywydd, is why this is a budget for hope, a budget which sets out on that path to deliver a brighter future, and I commend it to the Senedd.
Peter Fox.
Well, diolch, Llywydd. And first, can I thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for your engagement with me ahead of this and other fiscal events. It's very much appreciated. It's very difficult to try and wade through 39 pages of budget statement in a quarter of an hour. Llywydd, as I've said many times before in this chamber, leadership is all about choices, taking responsibility for those choices. And we hear Labour constantly in this chamber blaming the Conservatives for everything that goes wrong here in Wales, despite the fact that they have been in power here for over 25 years. Now, it's now time that the Labour government took responsibility for their record here. The longest NHS waiting lists in the United Kingdom, the weakest economy and lowest pay in Great Britain, and a shocking decline in educational standards, leaving some pupils functionally illiterate. And now we have a Labour government in Westminster. The picture as a whole looks increasingly bleak. The UK government demonstrated in a matter of days where their priorities lay. We saw Labour take away winter fuel allowances from the most vulnerable in society at the same time as agreeing inflation-busting pay rises to pacify their union masters. I would have hoped to have seen in this draft budget schemes for pensioners in Wales who fall outside the threshold for the winter fuel allowance, but sadly it looks like they are going to face a dark and cold winter. Experts have said that thanks to Labour's first budget, growth is expected to slow once their tax and spend frenzy is over, and it's no wonder. Do I have to yet? Go on.
This is a debate. Here we go again.
Yes.
You tell us about the complaints of the revenue measures. They've been forced to raise because the black hole your government left. And you haven't said how you would fill the hole. A government has to fill the hole left.
That's right.
You're all talk.
Yeah, that's right. Well, thank you, Lee. I won't answer that now because I'm going to come on to that in a second. So, yes, so as I said, we hear about economic growth here being a priority in Wales. But how can that happen when both Labour governments just don't understand business? Yeah. You know, and they stand in the way of growth and of business. We know, if you listen, we know the UK Labour Party are going to levy tax on
Peter,
growth.
1 second. I would like to hear the contributions from all members, so please give them a chance to speak so I can hear them.
Yes, give me a chance. Yeah. We know the Labour Party are going to levy a tax on growth in the form of national insurance rises, making it more expensive for SMEs to hire staff. How is that going to solve the fact that Wales has the highest unemployment rates in the United Kingdom and an underperforming economy? There is little in this draft budget to change that. We know Labour will try and use, as we've just heard, the fictitious black hole to justify their actions and choices, despite the fact that the UK had the fastest growth in the G7 before Labour took over. We know growth is now forecast to shrink in a couple of years once Labour have spent all the money once again. So yes, the Welsh Government's budget has increased this year, but that is largely down to Labour's increased taxes and vast amounts of borrowing, which in the main will be paid for by small businesses and ultimately working people, and will leave our grandchildren with huge debts around their necks. Whilst Labour here are celebrating this new money, I ask, as many have, where are the billions in HS2 consequentials that Labour have been calling for and challenged us in this chamber at every time they could raise it? Our infrastructure is creaking and we need that money. Labour here should join us in standing up for the people of Wales and call for the billions that Wales is owed. Of course, we all welcome the increased investment into public services, but the reality is that much of the consequentials that UK government are the result of a maxed out credit card by the Labour's Chancellor. Whilst money for pay increases may be baselined, the rest of the money will not be recurring, so once it's gone, and it has to be used carefully to best effect. Every year, funding for our NHS increases, but at the same time, our waiting lists continue to hit record-breaking levels. Clearly, something is going wrong with the strategy, and the increased NHS funding is not solving the healthcare crisis. No. I hope, therefore, the Labour government will listen to our calls and commission an independent review into operational systems within hospitals and secondary care provision to ensure that every penny is spent efficiently. I personally believe this should be led by clinicians, health professionals, together with business mentors. It would not only lead to best models of practice, it would identify systems weaknesses and drive financial efficiencies. Sadly, every health board in Wales is under some form of enhanced monitoring or special measures at the moment. Things can't go on like this. To make matters worse, we are still far too reliant on agency staff and locums to fill our staffing gaps in Wales. An eye-watering £250 million was spent on agency staff to fill vacant NHS shifts here in Wales last year. Clearly, much more needs to be done to recruit and retain our NHS staff, to vastly reduce expenditure and relieve stress on those currently working in the health system. I'm pleased that more money has been allocated to social care, a move that we have long called for. Social care, including children and adult services, are a huge part of the £560 million financial pressure that our local authorities are facing. I fear, though, that the balance of investment is still not right, recognising the pressure in social care are fundamental barriers to unblocking our health system. I am also concerned that the additional £252 million to local government, while welcome, will still leave around £300 million worth of financial pressures on our councils, which will inevitably end up costing hard-working families in the form of additional council tax rises. The 4.3% increase will still leave several councils facing a cliff edge, I fear. However, the allocating of £5 million revenue to service £60 million worth of capital of local government borrowing to improve road and infrastructure repairs is welcome and something I would have advocated for myself. When it comes to the economy, to paraphrase a former minister who has already spoken today, it really is obvious that Labour don't know what they are doing when it comes to the economy. As I have previously said, both Labour governments say that they want growth, but the fact is that they stand in the way of growth. They should be creating the conditions where businesses can grow, thrive, not the opposite. Welsh businesses are paying the highest business rates in the United Kingdom, with small businesses in Wales still paying the same rate as large ones, despite Cabinet Ministers having the power to change that. However, I do welcome that the multiplier will be maintained at 1%. I'm glad to see that the Welsh Government has finally seen sense and is ensuring that businesses in retail, hospitality and leisure sector in Wales get the same business rate relief as their counterparts in England, something that didn't happen last year, with businesses in Wales paying double the business rates as their competitors across the border. Sadly, businesses are still being lumped with the increase of national insurance contribution as a result of UK Labour's broken manifesto pledge. To make matters worse, it is still not clear whether, despite all that has been said, if the UK Government will fully fund the public sector to pay for the Labour's latest tax hike on employers. Now, we welcome the additional funding for local government and the education system, some of which was announced last week for the current year. However, something is clearly going wrong. The additional capital will be welcome. However, the Welsh Government continues to fail to address absenteeism and has long failed to address the falling standards in our schools. How can our future generations hope to build a better Wales if many are starting high school functionally illiterate? Our educational system is absolutely fundamental to the future of our children and the future of Wales, yet the future of our young people is massively threatened as a direct consequence of 25 years of Labour's poor management of education. Rural affairs, turning to rural affairs, I welcome the fact that the rural affairs budget has increased. However, last year's cut saw £62 million taken away, a relative 13% cut, the largest of any departmental budget. So the rise that we're seeing now only makes up for about half of that, and the rural community will still remain concerned. This has to be made good in real terms. We can't see continued disinvestment and decline in our countryside and its economy. The simple truth is that our rural communities are facing extreme pressure and adversity from governments at both ends of the M4. This can't continue if we care about Wales. Llywed, my colleagues and I believe this draft budget will miss the mark when it comes to the priorities of the people of Wales in many ways. Sadly, families and businesses across Wales will continue to be let down by Labour. They need to realise it doesn't have to be this way in Wales.
Diolch i'r Llywed. It is remarkable when we think about previous budget debates where we heard Conservative benches that said that Wales had plentiful funding. We cannot forget the impact of 14 years of austerity. But neither can we forget the promises that were made for years in the run-up to the UK election. Promised that a change of UK government and having two Labour governments working at both ends of the M4 would be a game changer for Wales. And of course, whilst it's true that there is additional funding in this budget, and of course that is to be welcome, we have to remind ourselves that the funding made available to the Welsh Government falls short of the funding Wales is owed. And is also 1.3%. We've received the lowest real terms increase of all the devolved nations in resource funding up to 2025-26, so hardly the transformational change that the people of Wales were promised. Just imagine what we could do with the billions of pounds owed to us from HS2 if we could retain the vast wealth of our natural resources, and also if we had a funding model based on population need rather than the outdated Barnett formula. Without this, it is clear that despite the uplift, many sectors will still be left broken and uncertain about the future. Cuts will still have to be made, council tax will have to rise, and the backlog across the NHS estate will remain incredibly high. So yes, the investment is welcome, but it's a drop in the ocean of what's needed. It's also important to note, of the £1.7 billion in additional funding for the Welsh budget over the next 2 financial years, a large chunk will have to be swallowed up to offset the UK Government's short-sighted decision to increase employer national insurance contributions without reimbursing the cost for organisations and businesses that fall outside of the public sector, including third sector organisations and GP services and so on. I'm sure I'm not the only member that's been contacted and inundated with messages from organisations in my region, such as Citizens Advice, outlining the devastating impact this will have on their ability to support some of our most vulnerable constituents. I would be grateful, therefore, if the Cabinet Secretary could outline in his response to this debate the outcome of his discussions on this issue with the UK Chancellor, and if he's had any clarity yet on whether the UK Government are going to take steps to put right the damaging and unintended consequences of this decision. It's clear, therefore, that this budget will largely be used to plug the gaps created by Westminster and also by Labour mismanagement, rather than tackle some of the very real problems faced by so many of our communities. The fact that the Scottish Government has been able to introduce radical solutions to counteract the corrosive impact of the two-child benefit cap and the withdrawal of the winter fuel allowance also underlines the detrimental real-world consequences of this government's reluctance to seek further devolved powers. Do you not now regret that we don't have the same levers available to us as Scotland has, when you're seeing that they're able to take steps to protect their most vulnerable residents? In the meantime, whilst Welsh Government seems to settle and even welcome a fundamentally unfair settlement, our public services continue to face unrelenting pressures with resources stretched to breaking point. A damning indictment of the UK Labour government's failure to bring the disastrous era of austerity to a conclusion. In terms of local government, 4.3% on average. I attended a recent briefing organised by the WLGA, where they were very clear, 5% as a minimum for all. What will this mean for so many services in our communities? It will be devastating. So the headlines may look like good news, but it's not good news for our local authorities that deliver these vital services. It's also worth emphasising that the quantum of funding alone does not in and of itself guarantee success. It's how the money is spent that's important. And on this front, the government's track record leaves a lot to be desired. And whilst the health budget in particular has grown significantly in recent years, we've seen little to no improvement on issues such as waiting lists, ambulance response times and targets for cancer treatment. So why should we expect any difference this time round? The diminished returns from this government spending on costly, sticking plaster solutions also means less money for practically every other policy area, leaving our universities facing an existential crisis, our schools' infrastructure in a decrepit state, and an arts and culture sector looking with envy to Scotland and Ireland, where there has been a significant uplift. Gwlad beirdd a chantorion enwogion o fri. Ydy hynny'n golygu...
Does that mean anything to this government? So many of our sectors are in extremely vulnerable positions, never mind our public services, and they will be disappointed today by a budget that gives them crumbs rather than the funding that they actually need. Just because this is a better budget than the one that we had from the Tories, it doesn't mean that it is adequate, and neither is it a budget that generates that change that Labour promised for years to the people of Wales. Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned a brighter future. Well, perhaps there is a glimmer of hope for some, but it leaves others in the dark. We look forward, therefore, to scrutinising this budget in detail, and we very much hope that we will see the government joining with us to insist on fair funding for Wales. That is what will bring change, that is what will bring prosperity, and that is what Wales deserves.
Carlin Thomas.
As a county councillor living through the decade and more of austerity, I will never forget the pain of trying to keep frontline services going while having to deliver year after year of cuts and efficiencies impacting on people's lives. Because of the terrible ideology of wanting a smaller public state, it went too far. I remember in 2017, Philip Hammond saying we needed to tighten the belt even further, but there were no holes left on the proverbial belt. We then had Brexit impacting Wales. We were net beneficiaries. The pandemic and massive inflation caused by the trust budget. No investment in UK energy and industry and no resilience. The economy crashed along with public services and many of the jobs they support, especially here in Wales. Thank goodness we have a UK government who have brought change and hope, who will be funding the much-needed public sector pay increases and our public services, the building blocks of our economy. We can't grow the economy without our public services, without educating people, without public transport, without housing, without keeping our workforce healthy. I will not forget the pain of having to make difficult decisions. History cannot be rewritten by the Conservatives, no matter how they try to repackage it. I realised when I became an MS, the Senedd is just like a big council. Having to work with the budget is dealt with by the UK Government with minimum borrowing powers and tax raising powers. We don't have many high earners in Wales, and 90% of the budget goes on public services. Over half the budget goes on health, local government, NLW, Transport for Wales, farming subsidies, just to name a few. Councils are facing a crisis with rising costs and increased demand for services. And as the leader of Flintshire Council says, having made £126 million of efficiencies, the steamroller has gone over the orange. There is nothing left to squeeze. The previous leadership of Conway Council cut services, used reserves rather than put up council taxes. So they have no resilience and cut to the bone and are desperate to deliver for its residents under increasing pressure. Thank goodness the new leadership have been innovative and started investing in council housing again, using the Welsh Government's grant funding available to them. I understand that 14 years of austerity cannot be undone in one financial year, but I welcome the first step. In fact, it was a huge relief to hear the budget when it was announced. We've seen the impact of flooding and landslides and the value of having public services and funding to help people at times of need. These are all public services. We have an older, sicker population, and children who need extra support have been born during the pandemic. We're all asking for additional learning needs. When councils are consistently low funded, they are unable to build resilience or keep reserves. I'm concerned that several North Wales councils, including Wrexham, have said they've run out of capital for match funding, so I'm hoping the Welsh Government will be able to work with them. I've attended meetings where the North Wales Health Board have asked for capital to invest in IT, which will help improve productivity of the health service, along with new machinery and equipment, and investment in buildings. So hopefully the Royal Alexandra refurbishment in Denbighshire can now go ahead, now that the taps have been turned on. I know that having this capital investment, this massive increase in capital money, can help with our health service so they can deliver the services. You know, the capital can help in a way with the revenue. I'm glad to see investment in roads and pavements. It's been a priority. It's prior to the First Minister. It's been one of mine for the last 3 years. I was in Connors-Kean in the summer with the First Minister, and I think nearly every resident said, can we fix the holes in the roads? And I didn't set it up, honestly. I know that because councils have been struggling with workforce, decreasing over the years and austerity, so and be able to actually deliver this capital investment in a year. So I was wondering if the Cabinet Secretary could say how we'll be using the Welsh reserves next year to help with that resilience, and maybe the 2-year programme. That would be really useful. So I just want to say finally that this change, I watched the budget year upon year over 14 years, and it was dismal and depressing, but it feels like finally there's hope. And we can provide decent services again for people. People just want a decent life. So I'm happy to support this budget. Thank you.
Mark Ashwood.
Well, during his Mansion House speech in 2005, Gordon Brown paid homage to the assembled ranks of bankers, noting your unique, innovative skills, your courage and steadfastness. He thanked them for the invaluable contribution you make to the prosperity of Britain. When he returned in 2007 to deliver his final Mansion House speech as Chancellor before he moved into number 10, he proclaimed a new world order has been created. Britain was a new world leader thanks to your efforts and ingenuity and creativity. He congratulated himself for resisting pressure to toughen up regulation of their activities. The 2008 financial crash followed, and in 2010, Labour bequeathed the worst budget deficit in the G20 and austerity. In the EU, the UK deficit was behind only Ireland and Greece. Bailout and bigger imposed cuts followed for them after they tried to follow the economic policies advocated by Labour and Plaid Cymru. In blaming the fiscal black hole Labour claims to have discovered after the UK general election on July the 4th, about which the UK Treasury has refused to provide key details, she failed to mention either that when Labour left office in 2010, the UK deficit stood at 10.3% of GDP, but when Conservatives left office last year, this year, the UK deficit stood at 4.4% of GDP, despite having had to borrow billions to support people and the economy through the pandemic and the global cost of living crisis, or that a chunk of the claimed black hole is down to political decisions taken by the new UK Labour government since 4th of July. As Paul Johnson, director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies think tank, said, Chancellor Rachel Reeves may be over-egging the £22 billion black hole. When speaking to the Mansion House audience last month, Rachel Reeves described what they do as the jewel in the crown of the British economy. She then went on to explain why she felt it was time to relax regulations to provide the city with the opportunity to grow the economy as they would wish. Reeves should have learned from Brown. Such comments always come before a crash. In reality, a return to boom and bust is threatened by the grim reaver. As the head of the Institute for Fiscal Studies think tank stated, measures in her budget last October were likely to keep inflation and interest rates higher, resulting in slower growth in later years. The CBI's post-budget survey revealed that nearly two-thirds of firms reported that the budget would damage UK investment, with half of firms looking to reduce headcount as a result. Overall, this will therefore mean lower tax revenues, lower government spending, cuts to vital services and consequent additional pressure on public services. One of the damaging consequences of the UK government's recent budget was the national insurance hike on charities and third sector bodies. Office of Budget Responsibility figures show that the average annual tax increase for employers will be in excess of £800 per employee. With approximately 134,500 people working in the Welsh voluntary sector, even with part-time work, this would suggest a total increase in the sector's national insurance bill of around £100 million a year. As the Wales Council for Voluntary Action states, many voluntary organisations in Wales operate under tight financial constraints and play a vital role in delivering essential services alongside the public sector, yet only public sector employers are set to be reimbursed for these increased costs. This is a significant new cost, they said, that many organisations simply cannot absorb without a corresponding impact on their service delivery. The Welsh Government relies on these vital services, which will only be safeguarded if the Welsh Government supports the charitable sector and mitigates against this short-sighted policy. This applies to bodies ranging from hospices in Wales, facing serious financial challenges and having to consider significant cuts, which would leave huge gaps in provision for the communities they serve that the health boards won't be able to replace. To Welsh Women's Aid, facing increasing costs, impossible decisions and tight budgets. To member-led charity Adferiad, providing help and support for people with mental health, addiction and co-occurring and complex needs, who told me last Friday that on national insurance alone, the Chancellor's budget will cost them £600,000 a year, and without mitigation, they will have to let staff go and reduce services. Unless the Welsh Government's budget enables the vital services provided by organisations such as these to continue and grow, the resource demand on statutory public services will grow exponentially.
Thank you, Dublywydd. Year after year, this government has been throwing billions of pounds at frontline health services in order to try to solve the problems that the government itself has created, with hardly any improvement in outcomes. Despite the boasts about the billions being spent on the health service, waiting lists remain stubbornly long. Almost half of cancer patients are not seen on time, and the ambulance targets have been missed so often that they are now meaningless. The result of this failed policy is that less money is available for almost every other policy area, such as local government, which does so much of the preventative work and essential care. Indeed, from what I see, almost 55% of the government's budget now goes on health by now. I wonder whether the government is the 8th health board in Wales. This unsustainable spending is reflected in the fact that financial losses across the health service are now £183 million. So I wonder whether the Cabinet Secretary can say whether the government expects to see these losses reducing by the end of this financial year. It is clear that the health service has a funding problem, especially after the damage that has been inflicted by almost a decade and a half of austerity. But it also suffers from the fact that this government has mismanaged the available resources so seriously. This is reflected in the fact that the government now has to allocate the majority of the £400 million additional funding to waiting lists. Not only will a significant percentage of this money will go towards purchasing capacity in the private sector, but if the government had succeeded in reaching its own targets of cutting the longest waiting lists by March 2023, there would be no need for this money and it could have been targeted towards other things. I wonder whether the Cabinet Secretary can detail how much of the increase in the budget of the Health and Care Department will go towards commissioning work from independent and private providers.
There's also the £262 million on agency staff due to an inability to address large gaps in the workforce. £10 million spent on an optometry electronic patient record system that's yet to see the light of day. £14 million to redesign the Grange Hospital less than 4 years after it was first opened, and the high-risk maintenance backlog in the NHS estate ballooning to almost £250 million. So what is the optimal level of yearly spending on agency fees that the Welsh Government is aiming to reach? All the while, funding for preventative measures is being cut. Welsh Cymru, for instance, a charity that has helped so many people to stop smoking and is currently doing key work on vapes and tobacco, is an example of a successful preventative project. So can the Cabinet Secretary detail how much have preventative and primary care budget lines increased in real terms relative to the previous financial year? And with Welsh Cymru, for instance, will the funding continue? I note with dismay the lack of focus on the care sector, with what looks at first glance like a real terms cut. Perhaps the Cabinet Secretary will want to clarify. Tens of thousands of unpaid carers depend on the short break scheme and the Carer Support Fund, for instance. So in his response, it would be appreciated if the Cabinet Secretary could confirm the level of funding for these funds. And if we are serious about getting to grips with the omni-crises facing our health service, then the social care sector must be funded properly. And it would be good to hear the rationale why the care sector continues to be the Cinderella service. Meanwhile, the continuation of austerity measures by the partners in power at Westminster, such as the withdrawal of the winter fuel allowance from thousands of Welsh pensioners, will exacerbate demand on already overstretched health services. Furthermore, the decision to increase employer NICs will lead to substantial additional costs next year for third sector organisations and GP practices that work closely with NHS health boards. So what proportion of the uplift to the health and social care MEG will be used to offset the rise in employer NICs amongst GPs and third sector health organisations? And most damning of all is the refusal of the Labour UK government to replace the outdated Barnett formula. The funding we receive back from Westminster remains fundamentally misaligned with the health needs of our population. This is the false economy on which the NHS now teeters. So while the NHS does need further investment, it also needs resources to be spent wisely. And this government has shown itself utterly incapable of doing so. So can the Cabinet Secretary confirm what discussions he's had with the Chancellor and the Prime Minister regarding ensuring fair funding for Wales?
Mike Hedges.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'll start off by welcoming the extra £1.5 billion for our public services and priorities, putting Wales back on the path to growth. This is money which is going to benefit all of us and all our constituents. I'm also pleased the government is allocating more than £3 billion of capital in the draft budget. Most of that money, if not all of it, will actually go into the private sector. So it'll actually help drive the economy. I think sometimes there's a confusion between the private and public sector. The public sector money spent on development actually makes its way into the private sector. But I've really got one thing, and only one thing I really want to get across. Can the Finance Secretary make available to Conservative and Plaid Cymru spokespeople all the information they need to produce an alternative budget? They say they do not have the information to do so, and that excuses them that they can't provide it. the Cabinet Secretary provide any information they want on the budget so they can produce their own budget? Because I understand that you haven't got the capacity to do it, but that's a different matter. The Conservative policy is straightforward. They oppose all tax rises, they oppose all new taxes, they oppose borrowing, they support additional money for being spent across portfolios, with their small suggestions of savings being really small. The SNP in Scotland offered to collect all taxes in Scotland and provide their share of the cost incurred by Westminster Government on areas such as state pension, defence, etc. Do Plaid Cymru want to do the same? The last time I saw it was they solved that problem by not funding the state pension. The budget debate consists of a discussion about how much to spend in different areas. And it's not good that we're not talking about cuts, we're talking about spending. The ability to vary income tax rates is an unusable power. Increased tax rates and people who have a choice on where they register will not register in Wales, and there will be an opposition to higher taxes in Wales than in England. Decrease them and reduce funding for public services. What action is being taken on increasing land transaction tax income without changing the rate by being more effective and efficient in the collection of that money? Also, I was very pleased with what the Cabinet Secretary said about land disposal tax, because it's an environment tax, not a means of raising money, and it needs to be set at such a level that throwing things in the ground becomes economically unviable. I just want to talk about some priority spending areas. Within health, primary care, diagnostics and health promotion, general practice sees approximately 90% of all patients' visits. It needs to be adequately funded at the minimum. The proportion of the health budget spent on the primary care needs protected, but an increase is what is needed. Continually, the share of health budget spent on primary care has reduced. This is what happened when primary care and secondary care were put under health boards. We continue to hold health debates, and be it dementia or cancer, we unanimously agree the importance of early diagnosis. This means spending on diagnostic tools. Health improvement is critical. Social prescribing leading to reduced obesity and increased fitness. The weakness of the Welsh economy is you have too few high-paid jobs in the high-wage economic sectors and growth sectors such as ICT and life sciences, which I seem to mention every week, and green energy. This works well around the world by government support the university sector. Education is the key to a successful economy. Support by governments for schools and colleges, improved skills and economic success should follow. Local government provides not just social care and education, but a whole range of services from leisure and parks to environment and roads. It is important that local government is adequately funded. Social care is the key to not only improving hospital throughput, but also decreasing hospital admissions. If people can get access to social care early enough, then they don't deteriorate to such an extent they end up going into hospital. Then when they're in hospital, to come out of hospital, they lose capacity while they're in hospital for a week or 2 weeks or even longer, and then they can't go back into their own homes. Getting social care working will reduce the number of people actually ending up in hospitals. Finally, something I talk about a lot, we need to improve efficiency and productivity in both the private and public sector. I mean, how many cataract operations should the average eye doctor undertake during a year? I don't know. Does anybody know? We need to have set levels of what we expect people to achieve. And then we can not punish them for not achieving it, but we can hold them to account for not achieving it.
Jane Dodds.
And firstly, I'd like to start by thanking the Cabinet Secretary for his engagement with myself. And I do welcome some of the commitments outlined in the draft budget we have here today, particularly the increase in the spending on health, and that there are no cuts to budget areas as there were last year. I just want to highlight a few areas, if I may. Just following on from Mike Hedges, I want to highlight the social care sector. Care Forum Wales has warned that the current crisis in care is as great a threat as COVID itself, with funding gaps that can no longer be ignored. Care homes in Wales are not huge businesses, they're small to medium businesses, but the rise in national insurance will cost them around 40 to 50 million pounds. So I would like to join with the other parties here to ask you to press the UK government to exempt the care sector from the national insurance increases. In Powys, we're seeing an increase in our care budget by around £4.4 million, driven by the increase in care in NI payments, but also the growing complexity of care needs that there is. We need to see that obviously social care and health are deeply interconnected. One cannot succeed without the other. And we need an increase in spending on both areas. So I do urge the Welsh Government, and I'd like to hear further from the Cabinet Secretary about options to look at how we increase hospital discharges, but also, as Mike Hedges has said, keeping people actually in their own homes. Beyond adult social care, our local authorities face enormous financial pressures. They have, according to the WLGA, a cumulative funding gap in the next 3 years of nearly £1.2 billion. These aren't just abstract numbers, they are losses that reshape our communities, our libraries, our playgrounds, our leisure centres. Once vibrant community hubs are disappearing, seemingly never to return. One-off funding packages do offer short-term relief, but they fall far short of what's needed in order for us to maintain these cherished spaces. Therefore, I'd like to hear from the Cabinet Secretary about what additional support the Welsh Government can offer to local authorities to protect our community assets and infrastructure. Turning to the environment, this year we have heard a succession of distressing revelations around water pollution. And despite water companies suffering multiple penalties for their dismal performances, they continue to misuse our funds and to pay their chief executives and senior staff eye-watering bonuses. They can't keep getting away with this. And on the other hand, we have Natural Resources Wales are being starved of funds. We've seen them close some of our excellent community and visitor centres, and they are at the heart of our communities in relation to helping to tackle water pollution. So I'd like to hear, if possible, how the Cabinet Secretary will increase funding to bodies like NRW in order to help them better police sewage breaches. And finally, I want to turn to an area that I feel very passionate about, and that's child poverty. Once again, we keep bringing back to the Welsh Government the fact that we have 28% of our children here in Wales poor. That keeps rising, sadly, every year. And we keep seeing, sadly, not just a direct effect on our children here in Wales as they grow up and don't have the benefits that other children have, but it affects our economy. And one of the big things that we can do, apart from, once again, I plead with the Welsh Government to say to the UK Government that they have to get rid of the two-child benefit cap. Apart from that, we can increase childcare. And if we do that, that will not only help our economy and get parents back into work, but that will also help our children have a better start in life and give them the opportunities that they need. We cannot be stagnant in our response to the fact that child poverty isn't moving. The Welsh Government must acknowledge what multiple reports, the sector and thousands of parents already know, that childcare is an investment in the future of Wales. So I do urge you to take decisive action on this particular area. And finally, Dydd Pwy Llywydd, we're always urged, and quite rightly, by the First Minister to consider how do we get money into this government. Well, we need to raise taxes, of course, and I can see that that is an issue that we can see perhaps wouldn't benefit us significantly here in Wales. But why not urge the UK Government to follow what the organisation called Patriotic Millionaires are urging, and that is to tax our richest, get money into the UK economy, and then get that money down into the Welsh economy. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Gareth Davies.
Thank you very much, Deputy Clerk. The extra £1.7 billion allocated to Wales in the Chancellor's autumn budget comes from the £40 billion in tax rises, which my colleague Peter Fox correctly identified is on a maxed out credit card. Before digging into this draft budget, it's important to address the broader economic picture across the UK and the UK Government's budgets, which has provided the additional monies to the Welsh Government. Rachel Reeves's budget also includes £40 billion in tax rises and another £32 billion in borrowing, and the burden of that taxation is already showing its effect on the economy, with all the indicators in the UK economy pointing to the recession on the horizon. And if we do go into recession, the Chancellor will not get the £40 billion extra in tax revenue she is expecting. But her spending will stay the same, which means her borrowing will go through the roof more than it currently is. This means that we are currently facing a situation where interest rates will have to go up to attract money into government coffers, and private investors will avoid the UK because we have a debt burden that we can't fulfil, an economy in recession, and likely sterling in freefall, and it has already fallen to 7% against the dollar since the Labour Party took office. So this is the death spiral we are potentially facing as a result of the UK Government's budget. We have the highest debt and tax as a percentage of GDP since World War II, so we should not be celebrating the little bit of extra money that Wales has received off the backs of small businesses and the elderly who have been stripped of their winter fuel payments. This draft budget by the Welsh Government is yet another year of pouring more and more money into failing schemes and government initiatives. When will the Welsh Government learn that pouring water into a leaky bucket isn't more money that is required? It is the competency to fix a broken system. Radical rethinking is required, thinking we have not seen in a quarter of a century from the party opposite. The Bevan Foundation found that since the 2024-25 budget, Wales has seen no improvement in living standards, with the proportion of people reporting going without everyday essentials being unchanged during this period. They also stated that in some ways the position has worsened, with more people saying that they are more in debt than previously, just like the government. The Welsh Government's record on social housing is also disappointing, meeting only a quarter of the housing budget. The local government settlement is up 4.3% on average, but like many other areas that have received more funding, this will be swallowed up by the national insurance rise made by the government at the other end of the M4. So if the public believe that additional funding is going to translate to better public services, waiting times coming down and potholes being filled, I have some bad news for them. The additional funding will go straight back to the Treasury and will not benefit people in Wales. So overall, there is... yes, please.
Well, you're portraying a doomsday. Actually, this is a good news budget, and it will improve people's lives. 40% of people in most communities are actually employed in the public sector. Those people know tomorrow their jobs will still be there. When your government was in charge, nobody knew if they had a job or a service the following day. So please at least recognise that there is some positivity here. It's not a doomsday.
Well, I'll wait and see evidence of that when waiting times start coming down. The government haven't met their waiting times target since they released them in 2008. So how are the people of Wales going to be reassured that extra funding for the NHS is actually going to equate to lower waiting times? I'll believe it when I see it, Joyce. Thank you very much. So overall, there is very little in this budget to reassure my constituents and small businesses, which are the backbone of the Welsh economy and are currently on their knees and have been ignored in this draft budget. And I urge the Welsh Government to seriously consider greater support for businesses, particularly given the £40 billion tax rises introduced by the Chancellor. Thank you very much.
Owen Griffiths.
And, I'd like to start with agreeing with Mike Hedges and saying that a line-by-line detail would be very beneficial to be able to actually answer some of those questions around what would we do, and maybe a Senedd Budget Office would help. Well, the granular detail is never given to us. I also welcome the additional funding for local government. This comes at a time when councils have had to make eye-watering cuts year after year as a result of Tory callous austerity agenda. But let's not get too carried away. The figures announced today mean that there is still going to be a shortfall in budgets of local authorities throughout Wales. This means that the axe will still be wielded on local services and local institutions. This also means the council tax will still have to rise at a time when many families are living from one pay packet to the next. This is why when talk of austerity being over is utter nonsense. If this was the case, then local government would be funded adequately. Unfortunately, that cannot be the case despite today's announcement. If austerity was a thing of the past, then my colleagues in councils would not be facing painful decisions as a result of the fiscal hand they have been dealt. Things like school transport, library services and council jobs would not be facing a bleak and uncertain future. Plaid Cymru has made it clear we want the entirety of the funding shortfall in local government to be met. There is also an unintended consequence on local government of the national insurance increase announced by your Labour Party colleagues in Westminster during the autumn budget. Whilst public sector workers are supposed to be excluded from the NIC increases, there are numerous third sector workers who contribute to frontline council services who will be impacted by these UK government decisions. And we are yet to know what the UK support package will look like, and that won't be announced until after the beginning of the next financial year. One third sector organisation that my office is in contact with has said the move will add a huge amount to their wage bill, affecting the services they can provide. Similarly, the extra tax for the extra cash for transport, whilst welcome in itself, is a drop in the ocean compared to what Wales should be getting. Until we receive the full devolution of rail power to Wales, until we get our full and fair allocation of all rail projects in England, not just for HS2, then we are still being shortchanged by the Treasury. And we'll probably delve into a little bit more of that in the Finance Committee debate tomorrow. Labour, who were once converted to the cause first championed by Plaid Cymru, swiftly changed their tune on the billions we are owed from HS2 funding as soon as it looked like they would have the ability to do something about it. The only word for this is shameful. It also remains concerned about the stark funding imbalance between buses, Wales's most used public transport, and rail, raising serious questions about Labour's priorities. Affordable, well-funded bus services and investments are vital to the success of the bus reform. But on top of this, the current financial neglect undermines numerous Labour promises and commitments on the bus investments and fare affordability. We have all been told by experts that the extra funding announced today for buses may not be sufficient to sustain existing routes and services, never mind expand upon them. We've been told that without additional funding, during the myriad of cost operators face, the future of bus services appear to be the highest fares and or fewer services. This is the reality of the situation. So that whether we are talking about local government, frontline services or transport systems, when will we see this so-called partnership in power actually deliver for our communities? Diolch.
Alan Davis.
I'd read the budget before I make a speech on it, frankly, because what I heard was very different. What I heard was the beginning of a turning of the corner, a bend in the road, from darkness into light. That's what I heard. I didn't hear all the cuts that we've heard for the last 14 years. I didn't hear about the erosion of public services. I heard a finance secretary who's investing in public services, who's investing in people, who's investing in places, who's investing in the future. Now, it's perfectly possible to say that more should go here and more should go there, and that we should have a budget which looks and feels somewhat different, but that's a different debate. That's a different debate, and it's not a debate that's been engaged with this afternoon on all sides of the chamber. I actually think that what the Finance Secretary has announced this afternoon is a good budget for Wales and a good budget for the future. And I don't test it on any philosophical argument that may or may not stand up to examination. I test it against what is good for the people of Blaenau Gwent. because the people of Blaenau Gwent have been on the sharp end of austerity. They've seen the reality of Tory cuts. They've seen what it means to them and their families and their services and their communities. They know what austerity means, whereas the restaurants of Mayfair don't understand it at all, and the Tories don't care about it. Let me tell you what austerity has done to the people of Blaenau Gwent. It's meant that we've seen a diminution, not only in the quality of life and the standards of living, but in our ability to lead the lives we want to lead and to plan for a future that we want. Now, you don't turn that round in 4 months or 5 months, and you don't turn that round in one budget, but what you do is make a statement of intent. What do you want to see for the future? What is the future that we are going to create? And that is what I heard the Finance Secretary say earlier this afternoon, and that's why I'd be very proud to support this budget, because I want to see that investment. And of course I want to see more investment. I want to see more investment in our public services. Of course I do. But I also want to see realistic investment that is sustainable over the long term. And I want to see a government that isn't timid or silent in the face of the challenges we face as a country. I want to see a government that is an activist government, a government that is investing in the future of our economy. We've already seen nearly £2 billion invested in dualling the 465 Heads of the Valleys Road. What I want to see now from this government is an investment in the education of people, in the communities along that road, so we can ensure that our people are able to take advantage of the opportunities created. I was in Ebbw Vale yesterday visiting the college there, and I saw how young people were investing their own futures, looking at different options, ideas about using artificial intelligence to deal with dementia, new concepts, concepts that simply didn't exist when I was in school and when many of us here were in school. I'll give way in a moment. But they are only able to pursue their dreams today because we invest in the whole of their education, from the early years through school to college and then on to university if they so wish, and into apprenticeships if they so wish to do so. Investing in those people, and what I see is a government prepared to do that.
You've taken an intervention, Alan. I was going to say, well, you mentioned some really good things there, like the 465 Heads of the Valleys Road. Could you understand how people in other parts of Wales might feel disenfranchised compared to that way? You see the comparison between the lack of investment in the A55 and healthcare innovation in North Wales, which someone from my constituency would be watching your speech saying, well, it's all right for you guys down here in Cardiff and down in the South Wales valleys, but what about for us guys up in North Wales?
Gareth, I was sent here to speak for my constituents. Perhaps your constituents need to send somebody here to speak for them. You know, and what I also see is a government investing in economic development. I want to see the investment in the infrastructure to support and to sustain the investment that we've already seen. And I want to see as well investment in the health and social services system that people in Blaenau Gwent depend upon. The health service was created in Blaenau Gwent, and what we need now are the GPs to deliver the health service that Nyron Bevan dreamt of, and this is a budget which begins to turn that corner as well. But we also need to ensure that we have a budget which invests in the future of our communities. And in my constituency, you do see the settlement at its most jagged, if you like, because in the Rhymney Valley, what you have is a railway line which is being invested in. It's a devolved line, the Core Valleys line, and that is having the investment that this government is prepared to put into it. In the Ebbw Vale line, the government has to borrow money in order to put money into it because it's not a devolved line. We need to have a settlement that puts the tools in the hands of ministers here to ensure that we are able to continue this investment and that we are able to continue to invest in the future. An activist government investing in our communities, our people, our places. That is the budget we heard this afternoon, and I'd invite everybody to support it.
Jonathan Saunders.
Thank you. What to follow Alan Davis with that contribution, endorsing this joke of a budget. But there again, we are in pantomime season. So I do acknowledge Finance Minister the amount of work that has gone into this preparation, but I have to raise my concerns once again that the ability of this Senedd to scrutinise the financial plans more effectively. And again, they've been undermined today. I don't consider it acceptable that the documents were only made available very shortly before the start of our plenary proceedings. Now, I'm going to focus on my own portfolio, actually, and a little bit on farming, the climate change and rural affairs. So the budget lines include constitutional reform, £2 million, justice transformation, £500,000, Senedd reform, something that I can tell you now the constituents of Aberconwy are furious about. They don't want 36 more politicians. They don't want to see the voting system change. But obviously the two parties, Plaid Cymru and Labour, have decided you'd rather spend that kind of money doing that than on our health service, on our education. Anyway, could you tell me what Senedd reform has to do with the climate change and rural affairs budget? Can you tell me what constitutional reform has to do with the climate change and rural affairs budget? Explain what justice transformation has to do with the climate change and rural affairs budget. You have declared some years ago now a climate change crisis, an urgency, and also a nature crisis. Yet the budget allocation for a lot of the environmental lines have reduced. So where is this crisis, this urgency that needs to be addressed? Biodiversity, evidence and peatlands, 24, 25, 25, 26, both 11 million. Forestry, 24, 25, 25, 26, just both 6.4 million. Environmental protection, just £2,000 more. It is just phenomenal how you can say one thing and do another. In the last 3 weeks, we've had 2 major storms with serious flooding and damage to our communities across Wales. Yet the flood risk management budget has only increased by 53,000. You could spend that alone in Aberconwy and not even touch the surface. So what discussions have you undertaken with NRW as to whether this is remotely enough to help them going forwards in mitigating our future flooding risk? I've long spoken about the huge potential to enhance nature and reduce carbon emissions through investing in the marine environment. As such, I was disappointed to read that the budget line for marine policy has had a real terms reduction, remaining at £1.7 million. Why? Minister, Cabinet Secretary, why are you not speaking to your own Cabinet and saying that is wrong? A WWF study found that 66% of publicly listed companies depend on the ocean health, with 8.4 trillion USD in assets and revenues at risk over the next 15 years under our current conditions. Therefore, a strategic investment in marine natural capital, but I shouldn't be saying this, you should be saying this as the Cabinet member for climate change, and a sustainable blue economy will yield significant ecological and economic benefits to our communities, particularly for our often struggling and, yes, neglected coastal communities. Policy interventions to attract private and blended finance, improve marine spatial planning and address ecological threats are urgently needed but remain conspicuously absent. Wales continues to fall behind England, but I don't think that position will be for long now that we've got a UK Labour government. But it has fallen behind over the 14 years that we've been lucky to have a Conservative government in Westminster. As I have previously advocated, Wales should be permitted to reinvest. This is about constructive opposition. If you don't want to listen, don't. As I have previously advocated, we should be permitted to reinvest fines collected within its borders. But I am utterly disappointed that this issue remains unaddressed, and that's with Labour in London and you here. Adopting the polluter pays principle would generate substantial funds for biodiversity and climate initiatives while holding those offenders accountable. An omission such as this
Janet, can you conclude now, please?
To lever readily available resources for ecological restoration. This once again highlights the Welsh Government's impotency when confronted with the influence of their big brother in Westminster. Diolch.
Luke Fletcher.
Diolch, Dipper Llywydd, and incredibly grateful for the opportunity to speak to this debate given the time constraints. So I'll focus in on one particular thing. Looking at the increase to the City and Growth Deals budget, the £85 million increase that we see there, I'd be really interested to know how government does a cost-benefit analysis around those increases, how, in essence, how do we justify that increases of this kind happen? Because time and time again, it comes across to me that people are unsure as to what exactly City and Growth Deals are achieving and how successful they are. The government asked us to propose potential things that we would cut in order to justify increases in other areas. So could I ask the government to potentially look at that increase again and look at how we might actually be able to siphon some of that increase into local authorities? Because the 4.3% uplift still doesn't go far enough. It doesn't address their needs, and we cannot afford to further hollow out local authority departments, especially the economic development and planning departments, because local authorities can be drivers for economic growth themselves, and industries are fairly united in saying that the biggest barrier to growth is that capacity within local authorities. So I think there is a case to be made that 85 million would go a lot further if it were with local government and help to pad out that capacity so that decisions can be made quicker. And on a related note, the 10% uplift for health is all well and good, but a focus on improving health outcomes has to also include a focus on funding local authorities correctly, because the reality is if we want to get there, we won't go far without them. So I would welcome the views of the Cabinet Secretary on that.
Lee Waters.
Deputy Llywydd, and I think this is a budget which has turned a corner. A sense of optimism finally is upon us. It is starting to put things right. I've sat with others in cabinets that have had to cut budgets, and we are having today a Welsh Government budget of £21 billion. And I would say to the opposition in this Senedd chamber that the budgets go up for the Senedd when there is a Labour government in Westminster. We've seen that in the early years of growth of devolution, and we've seen it again in this budget. And we have, for the first time, a draft budget with a capital investment programme standing at £3 billion, a 40% rise in the capital investment in the NHS. That is an enormous increase for our frontline staff. That means more scanners, it means modern buildings, it means repairing the buildings that we have, which will give the hard-pressed workforce a fighting chance of reaching the productivity improvements that we have asked of them. I'm also delighted to see ongoing investment in the Core Valleys line and the creation of a metro. This is one of the largest civil engineering projects in the UK, and already we seem to have pocketed it. But the costs still need to be met. The investment is ongoing. The work is incomplete, and a significant part of this budget is following through on that very sizable investment, which is already showing benefits and will continue to benefit communities for years to come. I welcome that in this budget, as I do the extra money for road and pavement maintenance, £60 million. And as part of the roads review that the government did, was about shifting investment away from building new roads into looking after the roads we already have. We have a massive backlog of one of our largest capital assets that Wales owns, and we are neglecting it, and it is crumbling, as it's been mentioned here before. So this money is very welcome, and I hope it's a part of an ongoing programme of shifting that spending into to maintenance. All of this stands in contrast with what we saw from a Conservative government. And remember, we could still have a Conservative government now. The UK Tory government didn't need to call that election. They could well have passed another budget, and we could have been standing here today dealing with the consequences of yet another austerity Tory government. Jeremy Hunt, in his last budget, gave us £1 million £1 million of extra capital, and today we're talking about the benefit of £235 million from a Labour Chancellor. That's the difference a partnership at both sides of the M4 makes. That's the difference a Labour government makes. Now, we've heard the opposition reaction, and this is the sort of thing I think that breeds cynicism in politics, because we've had, from the Conservatives, complaints about revenue-raising measures and demands for more money. You can't have more money without more spending. You can't have more spending without raising taxes. And you have no suggestions of how to do that. You decry the inheritance tax, you decry the death duties and the increase in national insurance. But we have a hole left to us. The Resolution Foundation said if Jeremy Hunt had delivered another budget, there'd been a £20 billion gap between what he said he'd spend and what he had money to spend on. So that money has to come from somewhere. They've offered nothing other than cynical emptiness around that. And Plaid Cymru, similarly, we have in this system a hardwired need to cooperate. That's the way the proportional representation system, a Labour government introduced against its own interests, by the way, and has continued to strengthen. And the consequence of that is cooperation. And cooperation means compromise. And Plaid Cymru have already said, before they heard the budget, that they would be voting against this budget. So how is that seriously engaging with the constitutional reality that we've all embraced? And also I would say to them, I've heard week after week demands for more spending from the government. They've been part of setting the budget in this place for a number of years now, and they've agreed with us a joint priority of free school meals. It's an excellent policy and they deserve their part of the credit for that, but that has cost at least £260 million. Now, there's a choice to be made. There's an opportunity cost for that £260 million. You can't sit here week after week and tell us we should be spending more on social care, more on flooding, more on the health service, more on education. You made your choice. You had an influence in the government. You choose free school meals. £260 million. Fantastic. But that means the money can't be spent twice. And I'm afraid, I know you think that you are on the up and are refusing to cooperate to try and exploit that. But the reality is, if you are in a position again to set a budget, you can't spend the money twice, and you need to confront that. And continue to pretend you can, I'm afraid, adds to the cynicism that so many people feel about politics. So I commend the budget and the job the Finance Secretary has set about doing. There's still room between this and the final budget to strengthen it further, and I'd like to hear from him how we can do more to make sure that the departmental spending meets our carbon budgets, our climate change commitments. How is that test being applied to all our spending so we make sure we follow through on the promise of the Future Generations Act?
And now dwi'n galw ar ysgrifennydd y Cabinet.
And I call on the Cabinet Secretary to reply.
In the time that I have available, I'll hope to respond to the main spokespeople. I won't have time to respond to all those questions that were really for my ministerial colleagues and will be pursued in front of committees, nor do I have time to respond to all the questions that were raised for the UK government and not for this government at all. I will respond to the specific questions that are for me as Finance Minister. I counted 4 of them in the last 90 minutes, and I'll respond to each one of those. In terms of the party spokespeople, Peter Fox started off by saying that all budgets are choices. He's right about that, of course. He then went on to read from a leaflet apparently written in the 1970s about trade union domination of the UK economy. That was before he went on to ask for more money for social care, for rural communities, for local government, before Janet Finn-Saunders asked for more money for coastal communities and for businesses. I understand the Conservative Party. The problem for them is so do the people of Wales, which is why they haven't voted for the Conservative Party in more than 150 years of democratic elections. And after today, they can look forward to start off on the next 150 years. I listened carefully, of course, to what Senedd Cymru said. She described £1.5 billion extra on a £26 billion budget as a drop in the ocean. Well, with some drop and some ocean. She too, of course, asked for more money for local government, more money for the arts. She referred, of course, to the Sainted Scots. There is a day of reckoning coming for Plaid Cymru, though, isn't there, on the budget. This is a budget that will provide faster treatment for thousands and thousands of people here in Wales. This is a budget that will build thousands of homes for people who so badly need them. This is a budget which will see all those children whose additional needs have not been met being met in the future, and they will vote against them all. That's the day of reckoning for Plaid Cymru. How many Plaid Cymru spokespeople did I hear tell me that there wasn't enough money in this budget for local government? There's £253 million extra for local government, and when you vote against the budget, you will be saying to those local authorities that you don't want them to have a single penny of it. That's what serious politics is about. That's what Lee Waters pointed to in his contribution, and that day of reckoning is coming your way in March. There is a period between the draft and the final budget when I will be, as I explained to the finance spokesperson of Plaid Cymru, open to discussions with you about how this budget can be improved. But if that's not the business you are in, then believe me, the people of Wales will see through you and the political games you think you can play with their futures. Let me point to the points that Jane Dodds made. Thank you to her for the welcome she gave to the extra investment in health, to the recognition she gave to the aspects of this budget that will support growth in future. She was one of the people who asked me a specific question, and that was on NRW and water pollution. And let me say to Jane or to any other members of the Chamber that I am very keen to invest in those powers of regulators where additional investment in regulators leads to additional income being raised by the activities that they undertake. And I'm very happy to continue that conversation with her after today. Mike Hedges asked me a specific question on LTT collection, and that's in exactly the same space. I didn't have a chance, Dipwylawyd, in my original remarks to draw attention to the fact that there is 600,000 extra in this budget for the Welsh Revenue Authority, and it's there because the outstanding work the authority has done in collecting land transaction tax in Wales has persuaded the Office of Budget Responsibility to recognise that that additional investment in this year's budget will be repaid 5 times over by the work that the Welsh Revenue Authority is now able to do. Caroline Thomas asked me about the Welsh Reserve. Dipwylawyd, happy to confirm today that my intention is to take into next year the Welsh Reserve with sufficient funding in it for us to be able to draw down the maximum that we are able in one financial year. It will have £125 million in revenue to draw down next year. It will have £50 million in capital to draw down next year. And that is the fund we have to draw on when unexpected events happen and when we need to support our local authorities, for example, in dealing with weather events. So I'm happy to confirm that that is the strategy we have adopted there. Luke Fletcher at least had the merit of engaging seriously in the debate. And as we've heard from others, there were few contributions that genuinely did that. On city and growth deals, the money is already committed. Half of it comes from the central government, half of it comes from the Welsh Government, and it is already committed with those city and growth deals, and it is local authorities that lead them all. The North Wales growth deal is led by the 6 local authorities in North Wales. The Cardiff Capital deal is led by the local authorities that make up the Cardiff Capital deal. The Swansea Bay growth deal is led by Swansea Authority with its 3 partners, as is the Mid Wales growth deal, a partnership between 2 local authorities in Powys and Ceredigion. The money isn't movable. That's the nature of the agreement we have. But even if it was, even if we did what Luke Fletcher suggested, we would be taking money from local authorities in one hand to give it back to them with the other. The final specific point I was asked Dipper was by Janet Finch and French Saunders. She asked me why the climate change MEG had money in it for constitutional matters and for justice matters, and it is simply this. It is that the Cabinet Secretary is also responsible for those things. And as he is... Yes, of course.
The climate change budget and the rural affairs budget has been put together now under one budget line. Do you think it'd be more appropriate if they could be separated out so you could actually scrutinise what's been spent in rural affairs and what's been spent in climate change rather than having them put together so you can't scrutinise them properly?
That is entirely possible, because we publish budgets at the MEG level, where you will see exactly the information that James Evans asking for, and you will see exactly the information that Janet Finch Saunders was anxious about, because she will see that those monies are there to allow the Cabinet Secretary to fulfil his responsibilities. This is the start of the process of looking at the Welsh Budget's proposals today. The process of scrutiny will go on over the coming weeks. There will be detailed opportunities in committee for colleagues here to ask all my Cabinet colleagues to explain why the decisions we have made have been made. But let's be clear. Those decisions this year, in sharp distinction to the last 2 years, will be questions about the growth that we are able to provide for our public services and Welsh citizens, instead of why we have had to reduce money from this budget and that budget in order to survive in the age of austerity. That's why it's a budget for growth. That's why it's a budget that allows us to start down that path of delivering a brighter future for people here in Wales. I look forward to the process. I look forward to the debate on the 4th of March, and I look forward to all of those parties here who have a genuine interest in securing the advantages we now have with a partnership between Labour in Wales and Labour in Westminster, allowing those investments to go ahead.